I'm Dr. Jinsy Andrews. I'm an ALS specialist, a clinical neurologist, and the director of neuromuscular clinical trials at Columbia University. I'm also a member of CUPA.
Hi, I'm Sabrina Paganoni. I'm a physician investigator in Boston at Mass General Hospital, and I design and lead several clinical trials and expanded access protocols.
So we wanted to share a little bit. Obviously, there's a lot of interest and exposure in the ALS community about expanded access, and both of us actually have extensive experience running clinical trials, and we wanted to talk a little bit about how expanded access has evolved in the field in terms of clinical trials landscape for ALS, and of course treatment development, because there's been a lot of activity over the last two years in terms of regulatory reviews and approvals for therapies that were given a little bit of flexibility during their review and allowed to be on the market. In terms of expanded access, traditionally, as most of you already know, expanded access is a formal mechanism within the Food and Drug Administration that allows someone with a serious life-threatening condition to access therapy, given that they've exhausted all other avenues, and it's intended for treatment, and there is really no primary intent of conducting research on that investigational product, and so historically hasn't been viewed as research. The ALS space, just to kind of give some context for those of you that may not be in the ALS space, there's no cure for ALS. ALS is a progressive neuromuscular neurodegenerative condition of the motor neurons that cause progressive weakness and affects the voluntary muscles for arms, legs, speaking, swallowing, and eventually breathing. There are approved therapies now that are available here in the United States that are not necessarily all available globally, but they're all disease-modifying treatments that are intended to slow down disease progression, but they're not curative and they don't improve symptoms. So there's still a high degree of high unmet need. This then prompts individuals living with ALS to come to their healthcare providers and ask for other alternatives in addition to what might be available in the region. And so a lot of times there's discussions about what are the investigational therapies or experimental therapies that might be out there that they may be willing to try. And there is a huge pipeline for clinical trial development actually now. And we're fortunate in the last 19 years I've been doing ALS, the pipeline has expanded dramatically, exponentially actually. But what has happened is that as we learn about ALS and we learn about the different versions of it and the different progressions and the lack of biomarkers to differentiate these, it's made the eligibility criteria a little bit more stringent. And so not everybody who comes through the door is eligible for clinical trials, which has prompted in the ALS field a more recent discussion about other avenues of pre-approval access, one such as expanded access. So I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Paganoni, who is at the Healy Center for ALS at Mass General, who really pioneered some of the early work in ALS and expanded access. So Dr. Paganoni, you know, I know you've had some experience, and if you could share your historical perspective.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for the background. That's very helpful. So I had to say I've been learning about expanded access from our patients and patient advocates, and also the chair of our department, Dr. Sukovich, who in talking with some of our patients in 2019, realized that, again, there was this path that was not well known. I understand in cancer or infectious diseases, it may have been around for longer, but for ALS, it was completely new. So in 2019, which feels like a century ago, but it's only 5 years ago, and I'll go back to that in a second. But again, it's relatively recently that this idea of expanded access was brought to the field, and it was because of the advocacy and fundraising that some patients at our center that we could actually start. So in 2019, 2020, we had a series of small expanded access protocols, some single patient, mostly intermediate access and intermediate size, for a variety of compounds that were also being tested in clinical trials. As Dr. Andrews explained, because there are scientific and statistical reasons for restricting eligibility to clinical trials, these small initial experiences allowed us to give access to people that wouldn't qualify for those clinical trials while the clinical trials were ongoing. Now, there was, again, an initial set of small programs that, as of today, actually have enrolled around 300 people at our institution. So as a single center set of protocols. Then around 2020, we launched a big trial called the platform trial, which is testing 7 drugs currently for the treatment of ALS. And that was deployed at over 70 centers in the United States. And we have a very active and very thoughtful patient advisory committee. And it was Sandy Morris, one of them, and some other advocates, some of them are in the room, who really told us, now that you have a network, why don't you expanded access to other sites? Again, up to that point, we had done it only as a single center, very early experiences, a few hundred patients, but again, still limited, certainly not meeting the huge unmet need. And so we started piloting this idea, and we opened something called the EAP companion to the trial. So we basically developed a set of templates, approaches, methodologies to lower the barriers for other sites to start expanded access. And so we partnered with 9 centers, geographically distributed, so that we could bring that experience kind of from coast to coast. And we enrolled, I think, about over 100 people through that mechanism in partnership with industry partners from the platform trial. In the meantime, kind of in parallel and independently, almost coincidentally, I would say, the Act for ALS passed, which is a legislation maybe you can tell us more about, that allowed us to kind of bring all of this to the next level. In fact, in our publications, I informally refer to our initial experiences 2019, 2020 as stage 1, our single center, 2020, 2021 as stage 2, the paper hopefully will be accepted soon for that, where we expanded to 9 sites, and stage 3, our current adventures, which are again much larger, broader in scope, size, reach, etc. So maybe you can tell us more what happened next.
Yeah, so I think with the experience of the small intermediate expanded access programs kind of bridging into actually being built into the platform trial infrastructure, it started to raise awareness of expanded access and the operational components and some of the operational limitations. Some of the things that are really limiting in ALS is that we do have a large number of individuals that may present and not qualify for a clinical trial, but they want to then proceed to try to access investigational products, but they might not be available for a number of reasons. One is that essentially a lot of small companies are in the space for ALS. We don't have many large scale pharmaceutical companies that have experience with expanded access. So when smaller companies come in, they're reserving their drug supplies and their resources to really completing the clinical trial. The second is that, obviously we had centers that were participating in the platform trial that were participating also in parallel to provide expanded access to those that were not clinical trial eligible, but that's not the entire ALS community. And as you heard earlier and in some of the workshops, not all the neurologists, especially community-based neurologists or neuromuscular specialists or ALS centers have the experience or the resources. And what I think one of the most important things is some of the early days in ALS, and for us, that's not so long ago, that's 2019. I think the first major conversations we had about expanded access in our field was in 2018. And so one of the major issues is like our understanding of how to incorporate it into the landscape of providing investigational therapies, but not compromising clinical trials, because we have such a small population that might be eligible that can answer that and hopefully lead to access if the drug works. So there was a lot of advocacy that led to a congressional hearing in 2021 about neurodegenerative diseases, including ALS, and talking about access and speeding the development of investigational products and meaningful therapies for all neurodegenerative diseases, but also for ALS. And at the end of 2021, the Act for ALS legislation was signed, and that appropriated funds for specific things. It wasn't just for expanded access. I just want to make it clear, because I think there's some, the funding wasn't just purely for investigation, access to investigational products through expanded access. That was one, but the access was contingent upon providing further research so we can understand ALS, we can identify biomarkers that can accelerate clinical trials and therapy development. there was a second component of a public-private partnership involving the FDA and the National Institute of Health to try to have priorities set to try to contribute to speeding up the development of potential meaningful therapies for ALS. And the third component is a granting mechanism for research or basic science research for rare diseases, including ALS, but also other neurodegenerative diseases, because if we understand the biology of these diseases, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, ALS, if we can validate better targets and understand biomarkers, we can definitely make clinical trials that'll be more likely to be successful. So there was a three-pronged approach. It wasn't just for EAP. And so 2022 was the first round of funding that was allocated for research and EAPs for ALS through the Act for ALS funding. And that then led to another round, and most recently was press released in September and October of 2023, where larger projects were funded through the NIH. So the NIH funds research, so it's not just to provide investigational therapy. So it blurs a little bit what we call EAP, right? So EAP in the ALS space is now embedded in research. And so there's a little bit of graying of those clear definitions that we have previously known for clinical trials and EAP. And it really is a nature probably unique to ALS, but probably unique to some other rare disorders where there might not be any other way to kind of help speed the development process for those particular disease areas. So those grants, now we have 4 funded projects. And honestly, some of the, prior to Act for ALS, some of these intermediate EAPs were 10, 20, 30 people. And most of the time they were funded through philanthropy. So this was, although there are folks on either side of the camps about government funding for this type of research and investigational access through expanded access. I mean, for the ALS field, this probably was something that would help catalyze the field to try to develop more meaningful investigational therapies, but also understand the biology in ALS and hopefully serve as a foundation. So that's kind of where we're at right now in the ALS field.
Yeah, I'll just make a few additional comments. So again, if you think about 2019, there was essentially one center doing EAPs in ALS. And now 5 years later, because of this law, the EAP is going to be available at over 50 sites geographically distributed across the US, both large academic centers and intentionally so small community practices, including areas that have been traditionally not involved in any type of ALS research whatsoever. And with a lot of options for remote monitoring to increase access and participation. So all of this to say that we have seen an incredible transformation in the landscape over the last 5 years, initially spearheaded by advocates, donors, philanthropists who wanted to kind of plant the seed. And now with this law and NIH funding, also, adding the research component to it. So I think, it's important to think about how these changes have developed in kind of, in steps. And we, and I know your team and other colleagues that we work closely with, are committed to sharing all the results in real time. So we already published a few papers about our initial experiences, including publishing templates and things that can help others submit new, INDs for expanded access if they wish to do so. And we will continue to publish all of these again, because I think it's important to lower the barriers for others to also initiate their own studies. And there's a lot of, the actual paperwork is not that bad, but then, it comes with a lot of responsibilities. The previous panel touched on important topics such as annual reporting, et cetera. Obviously, we do all of that, but all of that requires effort, staff, and knowledge. And so one aspect of exporting EAPs across the country is the education piece, which we keep doing with institutions, administrators, regulators, project managers, et cetera, because there's a whole infrastructure component to this that's important so that we can actually get high quality data and meet all regulatory standards.
Yeah, I think it was nice that the project facilitate panel happened before this. We don't have that quite in ALS, and I'm hoping that something like that could happen. And of course, in moving forward in trying to get these NIH funded EAPs, it's clear that there is an educational component. So both of us serve on the leadership for the Northeast ALS Consortium, and we're trying to incorporate educational tools for our peer physicians and clinical researchers on the website and also in the curriculum annually. So that's something that we need to do going forward. And actually at the workshop yesterday, it was a really great discussion. I learned so much from people in other fields, but also from people who are going through the experience. It's very clear that we also need to find some sort of centralized way of having information about what EAPs are available, what is the requirements, what are the participating sites, and clinicaltrials.gov may not be always the most reliable source, and having that tool really at the tip of the fingertips of not only people living with their disease, but also the healthcare providers that are interfacing with them, regardless of whether they're in an academic institution or not. So that was one of the other solutions that we have to find for ALS, but probably for other fields as well. And so that's kind of where we're at the moment. So we can take questions if anyone has any.
Hi, Kuldip Dave, Head of Research at the ALS Association. Two questions. One on the sunset features in the expanded access protocols. When Alexion wrapped up their champion trial in ALS, we at the association received many requests that, could patients that were in the trial, could they continue to get access to the drug through expanded access, even though the sponsor has terminated the study for lack of utility. So in the expanded access protocols or grants that you all have, how are you thinking about sunsetting expanded access if your drugs don't move forward because of lack of efficacy or anything like that? That's one. And then two, how do you make sure that there's fairness in the people that get access to expanded access? So, we had a recent experience of a sponsor that gave 10 EAPs to 10 people with ALS, but all 10 happened to have a big social media presence. So that was not done in a lottery way, right? So how do you make sure that it's not the best clinics or the most connected clinics, but that it's truly a lottery that, if you don't get access to a clinical trial and you can get access to expanded access, how does that happen in a fair fashion? So those are two questions, sunset and fairness.
These are great questions. We keep going forever on this. So, and hopefully I won't forget parts of it, but tell me if I'll start with the first topic. I think was about the sunsetting. I think that's very important, especially for these expanded access protocols funded by the NIH that have very deep research goals. The grants were written specifically with some provisions or some language about, how they would support the drug development plan. And that includes stopping the expanded access should there be an indication that the drug is, well, harmful for sure, but also, not effective. And I also want to mention that in addition to a data safety monitoring board that we have for these EAPs, just like you would have for any clinical trial, we also have a steering committee that includes representatives from the NIH and the patient community. And so we will be making those decisions together. So that's, I don't know.
And I'll just say that historically, I've actually had to face this both on the industry sponsor side as someone who is representing the sponsor, but and also on the clinician investigator side. There are a couple of things that we normally do. So number one, first and foremost, the investigator and the person participating in the EAP, open label extension, or a clinical trial always has a conversation about what the stopping criteria is for that access to investigational treatment. And it's something that's not always done, but especially in the expanded access situation, single patient or intermediate or a treatment protocol, at what stage would somebody would want to stop, or when would it be where the mechanism of action of that drug may not be so beneficial, number one. Number two, usually if the sponsor decides to stop development for whatever reason, whether the drug is not effective in that disease area, whether there's a safety issue, that's usually a stopping criteria. And the last is, as Dr. Paganoni explained, is like there are defined criteria for timelines within these granting mechanisms. And so sometimes there's this explicit statements of this is the access you'll get. And most of the protocols that have been funded through the NIH do try to provide as lengthy as possible treatment protocols, because prior to that, we could only provide usually 6 months to a year at best, depending on funding and depending on the sponsor.
Yeah, and then I think your second question was about fairness in selection. So, and I think your question was both selection of participants and selection of sites that participate. So in terms of sites, you know, again, we have been working hard to expand the network. And in the most recent iterations, again, over the last year, for the most recently, the 4 funded EAPs through the NIH grants, I think that now collectively it's over 50, perhaps even 60 sites. We should actually prepare a map, but they're clearly diverse in the sense of geography. So they're really, you know, in many states. There's both academic centers and community practices, both urban and rural locations, including areas that have not been traditionally participating in clinical research. For example, Puerto Rico comes to mind, or other areas that, you know, haven't had that kind of research opportunity before. So there's definitely been, so intentionally we try to include as many sites as possible. And that's actually been wonderful. I mean, it does require coming up with additional resources to make sure that we support the sites. For example, you know, translation of documents, for example, is, you know, worthwhile. You know, you need to plan for it, right? Or planning for travel if you go to more rural areas, etc. So we have, this is an ongoing conversation. I think I can say on behalf of all the people who are working on this, we are deeply committed, and we will continue to expand the options so that we can have more sites involved. In terms of the participants, that's also very important. I will say that, that there's been different mechanisms personally at my site. Whenever we have a mismatch, whenever there is a lot of requests for a trial or an EP, we actually do lottery. So we just, you know, put all the names and we just select them randomly and we go down the list. But, you know, other sites may have different methods, but, you know, there's definitely a need to continue to refine this approach.
Yeah, and I will add that the funded grants, one of the heavy emphasis was trying to create equity of access and diversity of participants that gain access by EAP. So I can only speak to the grant that I was funded for. One of the objectives is actually to test the feasibility of remotely providing EAP so that all 50 states and territories actually have access to the EAP through a remote virtual quote unquote site. And that was a provision really requested from the NIH so that we can get geographic diversity at minimum. And they do want us to monitor the population that does gain access. So that is an active part of all of the research grants. And then, as Dr. Paganoni mentioned, discussions about randomly allocating so that there's more fairness and access and equity at the site level are something that we continue to discuss at all of the participating sites. Holly?
Great. Thanks, everyone. My name is Holly Fernandez-Lynch. I'm on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, and I'm a CUPA member. I really appreciate both of your creativity in addressing these challenges. I also have 2 questions that I'm hoping you can address. One is part of the rationale that got put forward with regard to ACT for ALS. When asked, well, why just ALS? The response was, we can learn in ALS, and then we can kind of spin off what's working for other neurodegenerative diseases or other diseases more broadly. And so if there are any kind of preliminary lessons for how things have gone from ACT for ALS that might be more generalizable across disease areas, I thought that would be very helpful to hear. And then the other related question, right, is that you have this allocation of funds. It has to be appropriated every year. But regardless, right, there's going to be a bucket of money either from industry or from NIH for any of these programs that has to be divvied up in some way between research and expanded access. And I just love your views on what the right kind of proportions are for how much attention and funds should be devoted to research for the benefit of populations and future patients versus people who are in real critical need and hopefully able to access something early on. Thanks.
I can speak to the first about Act for ALS. Act for ALS, although ALS is at the forefront of that legislation, it really is pertinent to all neurodegenerative disorders. So the granting mechanisms, especially for the rare disease FDA grants, are not just for ALS. So I think that's one. The other is that in the process of the NIH funding of the EAPs and the attention to actually the ALS field, it's actually coordinated our entire field. And there are further granting mechanisms that have tried to do natural history studies. These natural history studies for ALS have now crossed over into the dementia space. And so some of the things that are being evaluated in the EAP, and I can speak to the EAP that I'm funded for, are looking at biomarkers that are shared across multiple neurodegenerative areas, and the investigational product is being tested in multiple neurological disorders, MS, ALS, and even other types of variants of Parkinson's disease. So I think in that way, it's not serving just the ALS community, but neurodegenerative. But that doesn't speak to everybody else, so that I think is a model maybe for other rare conditions that might share commonalities with other groups to probably think of this as a potential model. It's not ideal, and there are pros and cons to this whole structure. But sometimes there's no other option sometimes to get the field moving in the right direction. And we did see that funding, so the Ice Bucket Challenge happened in 2014, and that did spur a lot of research. And we discovered a lot of new genes, and we discovered a lot of gene therapies to target them, one of which received accelerated approval. But we need something that's more continual, and other diseases that have had successes can speak to this, right? So I think that's the first question. The second question
About proportionality between research and expanded access.
Yeah, I think this is where there's a little bit of a blurring. And so Act for ALS, that I have to say, it's kind of frustrating. I said this in the workshop yesterday, that the grants that are provided through Act for ALS are called EAPs. But if you look at the grants, they're like research projects. And there are aspects to it, and the one that I'm funded for actually try to validate predictive algorithms and clinical outcomes that could be used as potentially stratification variables to make more evenly allocated clinical trials, or try to use as a virtual placebo arm in the future. There are aspects of collecting biomarkers that might help with accelerated approvals in the future. And so there's a lot of research that's embedded within these. And I think that's the way the law was constructed to do that. So I think in that way, it's kind of difficult to say cleanly that X amount or X proportion or X percent is really dedicated to EAP and X percent is really for research and basic science or clinical research, because it actually is a blurring, which then begs the question, is EAP the right term? But that is the mechanism that we're using for the access for that investigational product. And for some of these programs that are funded through the NIH, the data that's being collected is data intended to evaluate safety, tolerability, and even potential efficacy by way of evaluating biomarkers in a more advanced population to see if an investigational product is more generalizable, because that's one of the counter arguments for some of the clinical trials that are rigorously done in ALS, that we're targeting an early onset population. It's not generalizable to the whole total population. And so in that way, the definition of EAP historically gets a little bit skewed in this setting. So I think that's kind of where we're at.
I'll just add one thing, as you're right, the lines are blurred. And so I won't repeat all the, great things you said. I'll just add a couple of things. Number one, we are actually learning as a field how to analyze some of the data. Exactly to your point, we have a team of statisticians looking at how to leverage the data to compare to, to use it compared to historical controls and things like that. The methods are not trivial. There's no textbook or recipe for it. So we're trying to develop them. And I think that's one benefit of the legislation and all the grants that came out of it. The other thing that I want to mention is, because we're collecting data and samples anyway, there's always extra samples, and obviously there's a lot of data. And ultimately, all of the data per grant requirements and the samples will be deposited into NIH-managed resources, both clinical data and biosamples, to be used for other projects. So I don't want, and I think we really need to emphasize the kind of, the potential for amplification of, whatever we're doing now will be amplified in future research. And so that's something maybe we should, continue to talk about, because I think it's been less,
I think that's my frustration sometimes, because some of the samples, like that's a great example. The biorepository, it's going to be an open access shared repository, one of the largest ever in the field, and it'll be actually the effort is really to try to merge all of it into one area, and hopefully all of the stakeholders in the field will kind of come around this to try to create a pool where we can actually understand the disease better and actually fund so future researchers can go back to this pool of data, clinical data and samples that are collected in a biorepository. We've always been talking about this. 20 years I've been in the field. We've been talking about a biorepository, but we always started, and then there's this like struggle for sustainability. Where does the money come? We got to fund the people, we got to fund the equipment, and we stall because we're a small community. And so these repositories were often like 100, 200, 1,000, but we need like 10,000, so it's
and now it's happening. Yeah, it's going to happen because of this.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm Kathy Collett, a very annoying ALS advocate. I wish we could clone you both for everybody with ALS. So at this very meeting 4 years ago, at the very end, after I'd been 2 days of hearing all about expanded access programs and talking to a lot of people in oncology, I asked a question. I said, this morning I looked up at clinicaltrials.gov, and I think we had then 52 ALS trials, 0 EAPs, none, nada. So thank you for what you've done to help this happen. And I think Act for ALS, we always got the we can't afford it argument from small companies. That helped neutralize that argument. And I think that's helped get things moving forward. But from what I heard yesterday, I think that the we can't afford it argument has now moved forward to providers and healthcare delivery. So I would like to get your thoughts on, do we have some simple solutions that we can do rather than, we don't need a law for everything. We don't need $1 bazillion for everything, but I keep thinking, I could ask you two right now to give me a cogent 2 minutes on expanded access if I'm a person with ALS or a caregiver on what I should do to start. Why can't we do that and post that somewhere and promote it? Why can't we do our own project facilitate? I mean, is it possible that we could hire 3 impecunious graduate students to staff a 1-800 help me find EAP? So do you have any thoughts on how we can do simple solutions for this to get us through this barrier that we found with healthcare delivery and providers? Thank you.
The answer was in your question. It really takes funding, and I'll be very blunt. I mean, it requires funding of personnel and dedicated to doing this. And frankly, some of the institutions that have successfully been able to manage the expanded access programs at their sites have support and individuals that are supported to do it. So many ALS centers are not 10, 15 ALS clinicians. They're usually 1 or 2 clinicians and a few research coordinators and a multidisciplinary staff. And some of the multidisciplinary staff, physical therapists, nurses, occupational therapists, speech therapists, are doubling as research so that they can stay sustainable. And so I've always talked about, I don't know if you know this, but I every time I go to any kind of group that has any funding capability, I always talk about research navigators or patient navigators or regional navigators to fund. And it's always a nice idea, but and there's always funding to start it. And in 2000, let's see, I had my 3rd kid in 2012. 2011, there was this funding opportunity and there was a network and regional, we pitched it and there was these regional navigators, but then the funding went away and the regional navigators went away. And that was just for clinical trials, because people at that time were complaining about not gaining access to clinical trials. It's funny that now we're here talking about expanded access. But I think something like that could be sustainable, and building that infrastructure could definitely help. The project facilitate model would be great for ALS, I think, because we have government entities that are now involved in the space. We didn't have that much conversation and crosstalk with all of the stakeholders in the field, but I think that that's one step in the right direction.
Yeah, and you raised a great point about healthcare delivery. I will say that in ALS now we are, things are really changed in terms of the number of people required to do ALS care and research. That number has gone up dramatically over the last 5 years because now we have more trials and expanded access opportunities than ever. It is actually very hard to find physicians who are trained in ALS care, coordinators, physical therapists, etc. The two of us and many other colleagues are working hard on that, but we almost need to scale the entire healthcare force, like in terms of interest and education in ALS. It won't happen overnight, but I can assure there's many people who are trying to do that in terms of, increasing the availability. I will say the funding is a big part, is a big component of this. So I think things like Act for ALS, and quite frankly, I think we need more than that. There is actually a bill that's been introduced to ask for more funding for ALS clinics, and all the major ALS foundations are supporting it, as well as the American Academy of Neurology. The reality is that we need more people.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Adria Martig, Global Medical ALS at Biogen. And I would love to hear your perspective from both of you as site investigators and also EAP providers on balancing EAP with clinical trial recruitment, clinical trial retention, and any experience that you've had with this, simultaneous grant program, and then also, the clinical trials that are ongoing for the platform drugs, for example.
Yeah, I can speak to it because this is a conversation I have like on a everyday basis. I think it's very important that when we're having the conversation as providers, we provide the eligibility information for clinical trials. So at my site at Columbia University, we do have clinical trials. We have specific clinical trials targeting specific gene mutations, and we have EAP programs, and all of them have different groups that they want to include in that particular program. And it's important that there's a distinction between, so in this scenario, there are clinical trials that are available. So someone might come in, and if they're clinical trial eligible, I will inform them of why the clinical trial is being offered, why the investigational product is being tested in ALS, and what the risks and benefits are. And if they choose to participate, then they'll go. I will also tell them about expanded access, but the way the expanded access programs at our site are structured, they're for individuals that are not clinical trial eligible. So sometimes that helps to kind of preserve the integrity of the clinical trial. And, I think it takes a long, and this is where there's the time component of a provider. I'm like a physician trying to talk to a person living with ALS, and I only have so much time. And so it does require additional time to explain the pros and cons of that, why it's set up this way, and that if the clinical trial doesn't pan out or if there's progression, we can consider EAP in the future should you not be eligible for another clinical trial. So it has to be a very careful conversation. I think I'll just say one thing, in providing both in the platform trial and also external to the Healy platform trial, we have been very good about preserving the integrity and the retention of participants in ALS clinical trials. And that's really because the community that's going through it is very active, very well informed, and they share information very quickly. And it's a credit to the community, really. And they know they want to get the information as quickly as possible for any investigational product, because that would be the fastest way to get it out to everybody. So I think in that way, I think it's very unique probably to ALS, but probably to other rare conditions as well. People understand.
I completely agree. The community is very educated on this. I really think this is a non-issue. I've never had an issue of competition or problems enrolling in clinical trials. And certainly expanded access doesn't affect that at all because of the clear differences in target population. In fact, one of the papers I was mentioning that's now under review clearly shows that. And so I think the more we publish our experience, the more it will be clear that that's not a problem.
And I'll just add, in terms of the clinical trial personnel resources, clinical trials in ALS also are becoming a little bit more complicated, involving more complicated routes of administration, complicated procedures, and frequent spinal taps. And so the draw on the staffing is pretty significant at this point in time. Ken, last question.
Ken Menkhaus, person living with ALS, a science question for you. Expanded access provides access for people who are no longer eligible, which means two years or more with the diagnosis. That is, by definition, that means a significant portion of that group are, like me, slow progressors. We can go for a long time without any change in our functional rating scale. How useful are we then as a section of subjects on this research compared to people with the much more rapid deterioration in their conditions where you can see an impact of a therapy?
So I'll start. It is true that there could be a difference between the cohort that would be enrolled in an expanded access versus those that might be targeted for a clinical trial. It is important for us to understand where the common factors are and where the differences lie. So the scientific question of what makes you a slow progressor versus somebody who's not. I don't have a clear answer today, but by evaluating some of the similar clinical outcomes, some of the similar biomarkers, I could probably tell somebody in the future. And where it becomes even more critical for that answer is when someone presents as their first visit. That's one of the questions. That's like the question that I get asked as a provider. Doc, what does my future look like? And so I don't have clear, so the prediction algorithms, the biomarkers, even clinical measures can give us some clues for that. So I think that's where one factor is. And the other is that when we look at an investigational product, it is getting a label by the FDA for ALS. And so understanding whether there is a distinction in the population that would be responsive to that treatment is also very important. Especially as a clinician, we have approved therapies now and people ask me, well, will I feel anything? Is it going to work for me? And sometimes I don't have a clear answer. As much as I appreciate the flexibility provided to get the approved product on the market, sometimes I don't have a clear answer. And that makes it hard. So I think those two are really key factors, I think, from a clinical perspective, that's important.
I think we have to wrap it up there. So thank you, Dr. Paganoni and Dr. Andrews.